sailor from Kingston. Right now I think he's sailing I-14s. He's a member of the Kingston Yacht Club. John is also the president of Wind Athletes, which is the financial arm of the Phelan Foundation, which has supported our high-level athletes and has supported Ontario Sailing this year for our high-performance program. But his other hat is he's a lawyer from Kingston, and especially his conflict and dealing with conflict in a simpler way or inexpensive way. John has done a number of presentations for us. He actually did the last time we had him was on the Not-for-Profit Act. I just saw the folks that were here for the Not-for-Profit Act. It's quite lively and quite interesting, and lots of things come up of it. But John is here actually in another capacity, looking at dealing with conflict around clubs, with members, and those types of things. So without any further ado, I'll introduce John Curtis.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you, everyone. Actually, now I'm sailing ice boats. We're praying for ice. Well, we haven't started yet, but in 2 weeks we're headed over to Minnesota to do some ice boat sailing. So Glenn also introduced me as a lawyer, and I tend to hesitate to do that these days. I like to list myself first as a mediator. I've tried law and it doesn't work very well, and so anyway, that's what my focus is on mediation now. So this is an interesting that I have been asked to give this talk. I'm calling it Conflict Management 101 for yacht clubs. I remember many years ago when I was in my first year of practice as a lawyer, I got elected to the board of the Kingston Yacht Club, and my portfolio was the junior sailing program, and that was actually easy relative to some of the controversy that started to develop at the club about whether or not the club should move. There was this movement afoot that we should sell the club and move to somewhere else and rent space. And anyway, it became extraordinarily acrimonious, and I can't say that I did a great job to make things better. That was before I saw the light. But anyway, I understand how difficult it can be at yacht clubs, and it seems kind of amazing because when I think of sailing, I think of at least for me, it's you have lots of people on one boat and they're very focused on the same goal. Well, it's probably not like that most of the time. In reality, that's great if you're training for the Olympics, and even then, it's not always harmony. I'll get to a story about that later. But when you're on a boat, people can have many different goals. You probably can't see this picture here, but this is a picture of a boat, an Open 60 that I had the privilege of sailing on with 5 other guys, and we were all pretty focused on the same thing. But I think you can all agree that a lot of the boats that you're racing on and cruising on, people have different goals. Some people are very focused on the results. Some people just like the social scene, and others, just like to be out on the water. So there's, and of course, there's also the occasional tyrant. We've all heard of them, Captain Bligh and company. Normally mild-mannered people who turn into raving lunatics on the water. So the yacht clubs are the same, though, as what we see on our boats. People have many different reasons for joining yacht clubs, and again, it might be the racing, it might be the social stuff, it might be so that their kids can have a safe place to play or whatever. You throw alcohol into the mix, as we know, and eventually, any collection of people is going to have conflict, alcohol or not. But I think the other thing too is that one of the things that sailing has taught me is that, and I'm sure it's taught many of you this lesson, that it's the ability to work through conflict that really unleashes the magic that is possible in sailing. So I think it's the same in any area of life. So I'm going to start by having a little bit of getting you up and moving a little bit. I know you've just had lunch. We're going to play a little bit of a game. So I'm going to ask everybody to pick a partner. And you're going to stand up somewhere close to your chair. I normally actually, have a big room that I can put a line down the middle of and get one set of partners on one side and one set on the other. But just imagine there's a line between you, and your job, both of your jobs, is to get your partner onto your side of the line. So I'm going to wander around and watch you doing this, and we're going to see how well you do at this small little artificial conflict. So go for it. Okay, you guys, come on. You got to get good at resolving conflict. Stand up, stand up. Cookies, you're going to persuade her with cookies, are you? So you're just going to, okay, well. What are you guys doing?
I'm going to buy him a drink.
Oh, okay.
I think that would...
Right, okay.
I was going to make it easy for him. I was just going to...
Just walk over, okay. All right.
So we agree.
Okay, perfect, great. What have you guys done?
I have a question though.
Okay.
Is it our job to get each other onto this? Do we have to stay on the same sideline ourselves?
That's up to you to interpret it.
I have a proposal. You want me on your side of the line. I like you on my side of the line. I don't mind moving myself. So if you stand on my side of the line and I stand on your side of the line, I think we will both agree to our objective.
Very clever. Okay. He wouldn't come for money. Okay, that's great. You can sit down, stop arguing. All right, well, that was great. We saw a bunch of different strategies there. Someone tried to get their person over with money. Over here, I think someone just said they just wanted to be agreeable, and they just stepped over to the other side of the line, even without any promise of anything. And what did you got? You had cookies, Christina? You had cookies that were good? And your crew, or your skipper, your crew was very good about just doing what you said. Yeah, sometimes that's what needs to happen, right? All right, and over here we had, who was it, Jeff? Jeff, I think, suggested that they both switch sides. So, then he was on her side and she was on his side, and it seemed like that sort of accomplished one interpretation of the project. Well, that's great. So I'm just going to go through these five. There are basically five responses to conflict. One would be to avoid, and the other is compete, accommodate, and compromise. I'm just going to read the slide a little bit because I don't think everyone can see it that well. So when we avoid, it's sort of an I lose, you lose. We both don't get what we really want, and we withdraw from the situation. But there's no one strategy that is the best all the time, right? So avoid may mean that you both lose, but it actually might be a good strategy sometimes, right? When people are drunk or shouting and screaming or need time to cool off, a temporary strategy of avoiding is actually quite good. Another situation in which it's quite good is maybe when you're never going to have a relationship with that person ever again, right? So it just doesn't matter. That's actually not that often, I would venture to guess, but that may be the case. Compete. So this is when, I win, you lose. It's a zero-sum game, and the winning party wins at the expense of the other party. And seeking to win your position at the expense of the other party losing theirs. And I have a little picture here of sailing at the Olympics. This is Oscar Johansson and I in 2004. And I always like to talk a little bit about this because sailing as a competitive sport isn't actually competition in a way in this sense of resolving conflict, because you're collaborating with a whole bunch of people. You're collaborating with the person you're sailing with, but you're actually collaborating with the other competitors. And one of the things that makes competition, sporting competition, different than this compete as a conflict resolution strategy is that typically it damages the relationship when you compete. But in sailing it doesn't. At least it shouldn't. If it's being taken in the right sort of spirit. And I was really reminded of this. I was always sort of aware of this as I was campaigning, but was really reminded in very starkly watching the America's Cup I sailed a catamaran, as you may know, and a lot of the guys that I competed against, and who were from different countries and maybe competing within their own country against each other, they were sailing on those boats together. It was quite amazing. Aussies and Kiwis, and mostly Aussies and Kiwis, but but there were Spanish guys and Portuguese and people, U.S. people from all over the place, and you could pretty much see that a lot of it had to do, a lot of their ability to function well on the same team was that they had always respected each other. In fact, a lot of them had, they'd been selected to the team, and then the team leader would say, okay, who else do you want to have? And they'd say, well, I want to have, that guy that I used to compete against and who we would, spar against out on the race course all the time. And there they were all sailing together, working as a team, and it was really quite neat. So I think, when we're doing sporting competition, if we're doing it right, I think it's not really, a competition in the way what this compete strategy and conflict resolution is. Anyway, so this I've already said this. One of the when we are using compete as a conflict resolution strategy, usually it will have a negative impact on the relationship. My way or the highway. Accommodate. I saw a little bit of this, accommodation. I saw quite a bit of that actually just now. So accommodate, basically you give in to the other party's demands. You lose, the other person wins, or you win and the other person loses. But it's not a competition. So one of the problems with accommodate, though, is that it often gets used as part of a larger strategy of compromise. So I'll accommodate you today, we'll go to your restaurant, but I'm expecting that we're going to go to my movie later on. And so really you're actually wanting it to be a compromise, which isn't necessarily a bad thing as long as the other person knows, right? So one of the biggest problems with accommodating is if you don't let the person you're accommodating know, they may just assume it doesn't matter to you at all. However, what the accommodator is really doing is they're saying the relationship is more important than the outcome here, so I'm going to give in. And we don't want to have covert contracts where we assume the other person means that means they're going to have to give in themselves. And of course, sometimes it does work. Sometimes we do have that understanding. I know, usually that works in marriages, right? That was a joke. So when is it appropriate? It's basically when your relationship, you're placing a higher value on your relationship than on the importance of the outcome in that particular case. So the downside, of course, you can be taken advantage of if you're doing that, and especially if you're not being clear that that's what you're doing. Compromise. So compromise, this is where we usually end up with most conflicts, right? We end up with a compromise. I think we kind of know what that means. Everybody gets a little bit of what they want, but you don't get everything. And of course, the reason why we usually end up in compromise is because the alternative, which is collaboration, takes a long time, right? It usually takes quite a bit longer to achieve your goals. So the thing with compromise, of course, is that it's most appropriate to use when time is relatively short, but the relationship and the outcome are roughly equal importance. So, and as I've said, well, there are shortfalls to all of these strategies, and one of the shortfalls to compromise is you really need, for it to work well, you need to have transparency and honesty. And I was reminded of this the other day that someone was talking to me about, oh yeah, we compromise all the time. And she was talking about a union management collective agreement negotiation that she'd just been in. And she said, what we do is we package up an offer for the other side that contains all kinds of stuff that we really don't care about giving up. And then, when it comes to compromising, we give up on those things and we're the good guy, right? So that's not really compromise. Not that that's not a tactic, that it is successful. It may well be, but that's not really compromise. That's subterfuge, right? So for it to really work well, it requires honesty and transparency. And then we have collaborate, and again, I just want to stress that I'm not suggesting that is the only and best strategy. It only works when the value of the relationship and the value of the outcome are roughly equal, and you have the time to work on it. But the rewards are fantastic because you end up being able to get more than what you would have got on your own, and that's sort of how you know you've had a successful collaboration. And I think any great racing team will tell you that that's what they've done. They had a successful collaboration. So as I said, you have to feel that the outcomes gained through collaboration are better than you could have achieved on your own. And again, the downside, it's very time consuming. This is a really neat little chart. I hope people can see this. But what it is it's got, I think maybe I better just stand here. Up in the top right-hand corner, you have collaborate. On the bottom left-hand corner, you have avoid. And on the axes, on the vertical axis, you've got the importance of the relationship. On the bottom, importance of the outcome. So as relationship increases in importance, you're going to be up in the quadrants where accommodate and collaborate are more likely to be the best strategy. And as the importance of outcome increases in relation to that, you're going to be out towards compete or compromise. But of course, neither one of those values is ever zero. Relationship, the importance of the relationship and the importance of the outcome, I would guess that they are just almost never zero. And if one of them truly is zero, you're really not negotiating. You're maybe not even have a pulse. But that was a joke too. So this is a really neat little chart, and you can if there's a series of questions that you can ask yourself that this suggests, and one is really how important is the relationship? How important is the outcome? Are they of equal value? Are they unequal value? And how long a time frame am I looking here? I think usually what we find is even if it feels like relationship is of very little importance today or right now, if we thought about, well, what will it be like a year from now or 2 years from now? Probably it will be higher than zero. So that's just a little bit of a background on just some ideas around conflict resolution. And I think the idea really is that you want to be strategic about what approach you're going to use. I don't really like the idea of calling them conflict styles. I think they should be conflict strategies. So if we are being strategic, we'll think about the relative importance of outcome and relationship, and we'll choose the most appropriate strategy. Now, of course, it's far more complicated than that because there's another person in the room, right, or other people, and they may not be very strategic, in fact. But that's another piece of the lecture for another time if we had time. But anyway, the idea really is that when it comes to conflict resolution, the first place to start is with yourself, right? Sorting out yourself and getting your own strategy on track. And I think that makes sense. So I'm going to talk now a little bit about conflict at the club. So conflict resolution starts with you. Are you using the right approach? Compete, collaborate, avoid, compromise, accommodate. So that's the first place I think to start with. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about this is a little bit more nuts and bolts. Some of you may feel a little more comfortable with this, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the two sort of basic types of conflicts that I've seen go on at yacht clubs. The first one really is the rogue member. I'll call the rogue member, the member who goes rogue. Sometimes there's more than one. And the other one would be, and of course I've experienced both of these, conflict on the board of directors. And that can be quite acrimonious, as I explained. I had that experience several years ago. It was actually many years ago now that I think of it. But these are kind of two areas that I think a lot of clubs who have experienced uncomfortable levels of conflict will agree are exist there. And I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about what do you do? Where do you start? What's important to think about as other than have I handled this? Selected my conflict resolution strategy appropriately. What are some of the other nuts and bolts that you should be thinking about? So I'll start with the rogue member. One of the things that as a lawyer I've often been called in when either a club wants to get rid of a member or a member's been got rid of and they aren't happy about it, and so they want me as a lawyer to make it right. I think the first place to start is to look at your bylaws. And I know that a lot of you are now going to be thinking about your bylaws because you've got to change them whenever this new act comes into force, if it does. I hear there was a great talk about that. I think everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? The Ontario Not-for-Profit Act, this new legislation that is going to require you to have bylaws that complies with the legislation. So I think a lot of people probably a lot of clubs have not looked at their bylaws in a long time, but most bylaws that I've seen, in fact, I would say every set of bylaws I've seen, even the really crummy ones, have a provision in there for termination or discipline of members. And often it's not very well laid out. And that actually is a problem. One of the things that this new act is going to, it talks about, there's a whole bunch of provisions in the new act that are going to make sure that you do that process right. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. But so start with your bylaws. They may have a great set of, like almost like a cookbook of how to expel a member or how to discipline a member. That is definitely the place to start. Another obvious place might be harassment policies or other conflict resolution policies. And again, most clubs pretty short on written policies, right? However, I think this is something that you're also going to need to address, and in fact already need to address, because the Occupational Health and Safety Act may apply to your club. And every situation is slightly different. It depends. A lot depends. I know the lawyer who who spoke before lunch was talking about a lot of things that depend on this, depends on that. But Section 32 of that, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which got amended with Bill 168. Probably lots of people have heard of Bill 168. People don't actually often refer to the Occupational Health and Safety Act. They refer to Bill 168. And the most important thing you need to think about or know about there is that if you have 6 or more employees, the Act probably applies. And then what does that mean? Well, that means that there's all kinds of requirements to have harassment programs, they call them, but it actually means the written policies and for harassment and also for violence in the workplace. So that may be a place to go if you have a policy. And if you don't have a policy, depending on your club, you probably should. So that's another little piece. Another place to go is, does the racing rules of sailing, Rule 69, does that apply? Because that can sometimes be a good way to, to force the conflict into some kind of a process, some kind of a formalized process. One of the things I say is, has anyone just sat down to talk? And of course, we often think we have done that, and it's often easier said than done. And one of the biggest problems with that is that you have to think first very carefully about making sure that the person who's going to manage that discussion is probably not directly involved, but more than that they have some kind of moral authority to be sitting there. And sometimes that's really tough to find someone like that in the club, someone who really is that distant and neutral. And that can be difficult. And that brings me to the next point, mediation. Is mediation an option? I don't know if you probably don't all know what mediation is, but mediation is when you bring in a neutral third party who's completely unconnected with the conflict, who is not a judge. They are not going to decide what is going to happen. They basically are people who are good at listening and getting both sides to communicate with each other effectively. And the hope is that the parties will come up with their own solution through the assistance of the mediator, rather than having something imposed on them, either by some board of directors that's having a disciplinary hearing or a court or whatever. So at the end of a mediation, the parties can actually form a contract, either a new contract or revise an old one or whatever. So, but I think it's often overlooked. It's underused, the mediation option, and I think one of the reasons why is because people just don't think of it, and they're not really sure how it all works. The other thing might be cost, and I think what you'll find if you look into mediation, in your community, you'll probably find there are community agencies that will offer it at either no or very low cost. So I would encourage you to, if you live here, Port Credit Mediation, ask Dr. Google. But often for about a 3-hour session, you can expect to pay about $600. And if it's longer, my average mediation day is between $12 and $2,000 because we typically take a lot longer than 3 hours, and I'm not charging the very base rate that a $600 mediator would be charging. But it is not an insurmountable cost, and I think when you compare it to the cost of even if you don't spend money on it down the road, all the acrimony and the bad blood, and maybe you lose members. And I know that conflict that I was involved with at the Kingston Yacht Club about 15 years ago, I think about 5 of the 12 people on the board, these were very engaged yacht club members. They're no longer there. They just decided that they'd had enough. So what's the cost of that? It's a lot more than $600. So anyway, mediation may be an option. And then finally, because I have to put my lawyer hat back on sometimes, you may want to initiate a termination or disciplinary proceeding under your bylaws, presuming it's in there. If it's not in there, it's questionable whether you actually even have a right to terminate a member. This is one of the reasons why the new act, the new Not-for-Profit Act, was put in place, because there would be weird situations where you'd have a long-standing organization, it was having a problem, and there just was no solution because there were no rules governing how to resolve that problem. Well, the new act, Section 51, and if anyone's taking notes, it's worth looking at. Of course, it's not enforced yet, but I really like it because, well, for a few reasons. One is it talks about exactly what you need to do. And it basically raises the bar for having a very solid process or procedure. And it actually has some nuts and bolts guidance on what you have to do to make sure that you do it right. And there are things like making sure you select an unbiased decision-making body, an opportunity to be heard. The person who's being terminated or disciplined needs to be have an opportunity to be heard. Some of those things are actually not in there, but they talk about giving people notice and all that kind of thing. If this is handled poorly, I can guarantee you it can cost a lot more than even $2,000 when you actually go down that formal route. So I've got a short selection of high points from Section 51 here. One of the things that it has is it talks about a good faith requirement. So any disciplinary action or termination of a membership must be done in good faith in a fair and reasonable manner. So what does that mean? Well, I can tell you the way the courts are going to interpret that is, you're going to have an unbiased decision-making committee. So, if someone had an altercation with the Commodore and you decide that the executive committee of the yacht club is going to hold a disciplinary hearing, and the Commodore is the chair of that committee and makes a decision to kick you out, probably that's not going to fly because you don't have an unbiased decision maker. And one of the very interesting things about this new act is that, and this was possible in the past, but now it's really flagged. The aggrieved member who has problems with the way the process was handled can actually take it to court, and it says it right in the act. So, they would apply for judicial review, I assume, and I think that would be vastly more expensive than $2,000. But anyway, something to think about. So, so that's the rogue member type of conflict. So now conflict on the board, and this can be somewhat different. But again, we go back to what do the bylaws say. And in fact, you may actually have to look back at the letters patent as well, which is the very first document. So often they'll have rules in there or something that will help you understand what some of the rules are anyway. You got to start there. You have to look there. It may have nothing of any significance. It may not be helpful, but start with the bylaws and the letters patent. And the things that you're kind of looking for are are you going to need a 2/3 majority, for a particular decision or a particular option that you may choose in terms of resolving the conflict? The other thing is, are you going to have to go back to the members? If there's absolutely no guidance in the bylaws or the letters patent, the common law really says that the ultimate decision makers, when you can't make a decision, are the members. So you might have to have a special general meeting or something like that. And the provisions for how to do that and when to do that are probably in the bylaws. And if they're not, they should be. And if you modify them, and if you don't update them under the new act, that will be implied. Those kinds of rules. When do you need to go to the membership? So another thing to think about, and this is kind of an obvious thing, and probably most decently functioning clubs will have this, is rules of order. Have you adopted rules of order? Because sometimes it'll be a question, there'll be a dispute about a question that's not really all that clear from the bylaws. It's not clear from past practice. It's just not clear. And so having rules of order, you maybe adopt Robert's Rules of Order. There are other ones out there, and some may be better for not-for-profits and small clubs. And usually you want it to be simple, right? You don't want it to be a great long thing, but having rules of order is very useful. The other thing is figuring out, is it a personality clash versus is it a disagreement on substance? And often they're mixed, right? So, when we had that debate at the Kingston Yacht Club about whether or not to move the club, it started out as a matter of substance and very quickly degenerated into a personality clash, and we really weren't talking about very much useful content. Anyway, so, and when we have that kind of situation, the other question is it sort of a personality clash mainly between 2 or 3 protagonists? And would they benefit from having sort of a side mediation? Separate them, they have a mediation, they get on the same page, they come back, and maybe function returns to the board. That's a typical scenario that I see happening in the workplace, where you have usually 2 people who are having troubles getting along, and the workplace sort of polarizes on either side of them, and then nobody can actually be productive. Sometimes by taking them aside and having a mediation, or at least getting them to work their issues out, allows them to come back to the group, and the group magically returns to functionality. The other thing too is sometimes these things are, they really do start out as disagreements of substance. Whether to move the yacht club, it was a real question. It was a useful question. It was not a stupid question. But the problem was we hadn't really done enough or the right kind of strategic planning. And so I think when we're having conflict on the board, and we've established that there's some substantive differences and disagreements, that's probably a time to step back from the micro issues and do a bit of strategic planning. And I know that the Kingston Yacht Club's actually recently done a great job of this. It's really wonderful to watch how well the place is being managed since I was partly in charge. It's largely due to Paul Davis, who I think probably many of you know, and he has just been a terrific leader in terms of having a disciplined approach to examining the future of the club and engaging the club in the club members in a discussion. And as many of you, I'm sure, know, it's not always an easy thing to do to get the members engaged, right? They just want to come down here and go sailing or drink beer, and but he was really good at getting everybody engaged in that process. And basically now we're talking about putting in more docks, essentially, and it's part of a longer-term plan to probably rebuild the clubhouse on the current site. So the other question, of course, is, what is the pattern of dysfunction on the board? If it's something that's so basic that business is not being accomplished, you may have a situation where you need some advice, you need some legal advice. And often that's a case where you are going to have a general meeting, a special general meeting, and maybe replace the board. Or get their guidance, get the members' guidance on things, and that's a complicated thing too, and would benefit from the help of a seasoned hand. And I'm sure Glenn is always available to help advise, as to maybe who's been through this before, and connect you with the right people. The other thing is, do you need a facilitator or a mediator? Sometimes that can really help. You bring in a mediator and they help explain the idea about having 2 people who aren't getting along. Sometimes a mediator can work with the whole group too, and I tend to call that person kind of more of a facilitator than a hardcore mediator, just because it's a bit of a different role when you're dealing with a larger group. But you also may need to get legal help if somebody has resigned, or if there's, you can't get quorum or something like that. So facilitators, mediators, having people come in who have experience in the field with similar problems, all good ideas when you've got kind of a pattern of dysfunction and you're not able to manage the business of your club. And of course, if the conflict on the board is really actually a rogue member problem, well, I guess you go back to the start of the list for rogue members. So I'm just going to finish off this talk. So those are the two basic, most common types of conflict that you're going to experience. And I guess if I could just finish off with the idea that if you select the correct conflict resolution strategy for yourself, but after you've done that, start with listening. I think that's one of the most important things with conflict resolution. I teach this all the time, and we always come back to listening. Listening is a complicated thing, but in some ways it's actually not. Really, it's about trying to understand what the other person, how they're connecting the dots, not about whether they're right or wrong. If you're listening for whether you can beat them in an argument, that's a different kind of listening than listening to how it makes sense to them. It's quite a fundamental difference. But start with listening. Ensure an opportunity for all parties to be understood, and of course, consider getting assistance with this if no one can be neutral enough. And I think that's really an important thing. I mean, it is very hard to listen well when we're in the thick of it, when we have an interest in the outcome ourselves. So that's when getting somebody who's from the outside can help. So this last slide, just like to finish with this. The value of conflict. Without difficulties, life would be like a stream without rocks and curves, about as interesting as concrete. Without problems, there can be no personal growth, no group achievement, no progress for humanity. But what matters about problems is what one does with them. So this is a quote from The Tale of Piglet by Benjamin Hoff. And I really like that because I think conflict really is an opportunity. And I go back to the sailing example, and conflict at work. There we are at work. I actually got paid to sail on that boat, so it kind of was at work. But it's also conflict working for us. And I have a little story about sailing with Oscar Johansson, who I'm sure some of you know. When Oscar and I were probably about a year and a half into our Olympic campaign, one pattern of behavior that we had that was really not working well was we were having an ongoing argument about who was in charge of looking at the compass and determining what the compass was telling us. And I'm sure most of you know that in sailing we use compasses to determine wind shifts and things like that. And as a single-handed sailor, he had formerly sailed lasers until we started sailing together. He thought that he should look at the compass because that's what he's always done. And, I suppose that makes some sense. And I thought that I should look at the compass and he shouldn't look at it at all because he's got a lot of other stuff to look at and needs to concentrate harder, and, I can do a better job of it. So, it was all about who should look at the compass. And in the end, we ended up deciding that it was actually better if we both looked at the compass. I looked at it more, he looked at it less, but it really helped us with a whole bunch of our other communication because if he took a glance at the compass and said, "Oh my goodness, we're headed 15 degrees," and he would articulate that to me and say, "We need to tack," I'd say, "Yeah, but you know what? I think it was just that bad set of waves we hit." And I was able to say that because it's right back now to where it's been most of the time. And then we'd actually learn something. We'd realize that we were footing a lot in those waves, and that was new, useful information that we wouldn't really have put together, wouldn't have been on the table unless unless we had that discussion and that he was looking at the compass and I was looking at the compass. And that's just one of many examples for you sailors out there. You've got to talk about the compass together. Anyway, so thank you very much. That's my presentation.
Do we have questions for John?
Are the charts going to be available?
Yes. So all the presentations, as long as the presenters are comfortable with it.
Yep, I'll give you that. I'll send that out.
We'll upload them on our website.
Yes, it includes the pictures. Yeah. That picture, by the way, very interesting. I don't know if any of you have seen the Ultimate Sailing Calendar that was for this past year. O Canada was July, and it wasn't that picture, which actually I think is a little bit better, but Sharon Green took another picture of O Canada that same day. That's actually sailing in the Molokai Channel off of Hawaii after the Transpac, and we let her have a spot in our helicopter because Paul had rented the only 2 helicopters that were available that day. So anyway, that's you can see lots of those pictures in your Ultimate Sailing Calendar. Yes?
We all belong to organizations that are fairly small and with long-term memberships and histories of relationships. How do you stop conflict from not being personal, not being personal?
I don't think you can. The question was, how do you stop a conflict from getting personal? And I don't think you can control whether or not it gets personal. You can control what you do after that. When the parties are unable to move beyond those personal differences, personal conflicts, I would recommend, if it's important enough to the club, right? If avoid isn't the best strategy for some reason, I would recommend that the parties do get some kind of assistance having a conversation, and that's what mediators do. It sounds like a simple answer, and what do mediators do? How do they do that? I mean, if we had the rest of the week, I could probably explain a little bit about that, but it's a complicated thing. But basically, they help people communicate more effectively and start writing a new script. So, good question.
From my desk where I sit, one of the things at clubs, one of the greatest things you've got to learn is to know when to ask for some help. And a member organization like Ontario Sailing or Sail Canada isn't just about taking your money. It's about supporting you. And don't be afraid to pick up the phone and call and say, I think we're having an issue. Because if you can catch it early enough, or have maybe a suggestion. What I tend to see when there's about 200 different organizations that are members of ours, I've seen it, heard it, and if I haven't heard it, maybe somebody else on the staff has, or we reach back to somebody like John or one of our supporters. But sometimes clubs let things go too far, and then it may always be personal. We may have a suggestion or a compromise or an idea, or maybe step in and be able to help. But that's something that you've got to remember, that people hear this time and time again from me. We're not just about collecting money from you. We're there when you need us. And sometimes it's us saying you need some legal help right away, or you need maybe some financial help, like a CA if you don't have one at your club. But I think that's another area that I think fits right in with John's session is know when to ask, and ask sooner than later. That's just my point.
Just one other thing. One of the problems that one of the more nuanced problems, but it's actually very common, is that when you do have a conflict between 2 people and it's personal, neither of them or only one of them actually wants to deal with it. And so what do you do when 2 people won't sit down with a mediator or anybody? How do you move forward? And there is something called conflict coaching as well, which is a kind of a one-on-one mediation. I know it sounds kind of weird, but what conflict coaches do is help the at least one party who is interested in sitting down and moving forward. They help them form a new perspective on the problem so that they can come up with new solutions of their own to move forward. So that's another thing. But a great question. Thanks. Any other? Yeah. Do I ever use justice circles? That's a good question. I don't, but it's a kind of a form of mediation that was developed by the Native community, and that could be quite an interesting process at a club. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Part of the issue with justice circles is there has to be buy-in from a big group, and some people might, in Western culture, might just not buy into it enough. So But it's an interesting thought, and depending on where you have your club and who's involved, you might find that that works very well. I don't do that myself, but interesting suggestion. Thanks.
Well, on behalf of the group, I'd like to thank John for
Thanks, Glenn.
coming.
Thank you.
So we'll be splitting back up again. The club stream will be back up here. And for the coaches and officials are back downstairs, and the school sessions downstairs. Paul from Jiggysoft is going to do a presentation on his two software